Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Laura Wilkins and I am the Engagement and Outreach Coordinator for the Carnegie Center for Art and History and the Floyd County Library. So thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn program. This program is being recorded and it will be available for viewing on the Carnegie Center's YouTube channel after today's live program. It's my great pleasure to introduce Devyn McIlraith. Oh, I messed it up. Sorry. No, I didn't. I didn't look at my notes. Sorry, Devyn. Devyn McIlraith with the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. And today, Devyn is going to be speaking about the museum's quarantine quilt project, which encouraged artists to share their experiences during the quarantine that we all experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will tell you a little bit about Devyn before we get started, and as we maybe have some more folks joining us. And again, if you're joining us a little late, you haven't missed much. We're just doing our introductions. But again, we are recording today's program and you can access it afterward on our YouTube channel. Okay, Devyn McIlraith is the Collections Manager and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts, where she also runs Girl Scout programs, documents objects for exhibition, and hoards craft supplies. I know it's like, I know what that's like. I do the same. Previously, Devyn wrote a very long paper on archaeological ceramics through the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she got her master's degree in archaeology and a certificate in museum studies, and in her undergrad, a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a studio art minor. She can be found outside of work, analyzing details of a prospective cosplay, reading fantasy books, baking something, or saying hello to other people's dogs while on walks. I also do the same. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Devyn McIlraith with the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. Thank you so much for being with us today, Devyn. And we will have time for questions at the end of Devyn's presentation today. But if in the course of our conversation, you have a question during, you can feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can certainly call on you. And we are just excited to have Devyn with us today and to have a conversation about the Quarantine Quilt Project. So with that, thank you, Devyn, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you all for joining us today. So the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts is located in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, and it was formed out of a desire to record histories and stories of quilting and quilts. The museum's roots extend back to 1988, when a group of quilters in southeastern Wisconsin founded the Wisconsin Quilt History Project Incorporated, whose mission was to preserve the history and creativity expressed in quilts through documenting and research. Since 1988, over 8,000 quilts and their stories have been captured. These records provided the material for our award-winning book, Wisconsin Quilts, History in the Stitches, and also created a starting point for having a physical museum. In 2001, the Wisconsin Quilt History Project Incorp. Purchased the Hoffman Becker farmstead, and that became the future home for the museum, which is dedicated to preserving, creating, and teaching fiber arts. The 2.2-acre farm includes 7 original stone and timber structures: the dairy barn with silo, farmhouse, ice house and summer kitchen, smokehouse, and blacksmithery. And the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts has since refurbished the barn for our use as a gallery and education center, and that opened in 2011. So this year, we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary as a museum, and it's the 20th anniversary for the History in the Stitches book. I forgot to forward my slide. So that's what we look like, and that's the book. So why fiber arts? So any art that is incorporated or is made of fiber, we can collect, store, display, anything like that. So when you think about it, we have a very large amount of things that we can display at our museum here. So it focuses on the materials and the manual labor as part of the art. Fiber art focuses on the material and the manual labor as part of the artist and part of the artistry of the piece. Fiber art is traditionally women's work and women's history, and it is often a non-recorded portion of history. Sewing was often considered only women's work and regarded as unimportant or not important enough to record in those historical settings. So textiles have moved from the cultural, have moved along with cultural movements within Western society, and textiles are usually described as fiber, or we don't often describe textiles in history and different settings. So the Industrial Revolution changed the whole industry of textiles, and women started to sew less because it became more affordable to purchase well-made clothing from stores versus upcycling and recycling fabrics. Fabric retailers found that they needed to convince women to return to their sewing machines, so the companies devised a variety of strategies to revitalize sewing. A theme that many retailers employed was to send out messages that sewing not only saved money and let them explore their personal style, but was also a way to be feminine and show gracefulness. So sewing was portrayed as a way to be a good mother and an attractive and thrifty wife. Fiber art has often branched into being both functional and artistic in nature now. So fiber art is on the cusp of, is it art or is it craft? And I would argue that it is both and always will be. So why quilts? Quilts often served as blankets, coverings, things to keep you warm, things to show that you love someone else. They also are used in very non-traditional ways to cover plants and windows and you name it, and I'm sure a quilt has been used for it. We have one upstairs right now that was used as a drop cloth, and somehow it survived this long with paint splatter all over it, but it is from like the 1890s, so very fun. They're often used to celebrate weddings, births, comfort for illness, war, and death. Only a small percentage of quilts made over the last few hundred years have survived due to the ease of textiles breaking down. And even though the name of the quilt maker, even if and when the name of a quilt maker is known, often the details surrounding why they made a piece are lost to history. Quilts have often historically been collaborative, and that was kind of the start for our whole project here. But women of the late 18th century or the colonial era used to share the work of quilt making out of necessity and also pleasure. So research in women's diaries and households have shown that women like to share textile work. A lot of that, they say, is kind of historically romanticized, that women would purposely get together and do those sort of things, but it also was out of necessity. So in the years past, a quilting bee was often a group of quilters getting together to work on the same quilt, are usually trying to hand quilt to speed up the process. Signature quilts like the lavender one and shown here were often made by a group of individuals who each made one of the blocks. We tend to visualize a woman making and signing the block to be later sewn together into a friendship quilt. Although this was a common practice, there were other ways a friendship quilt could be created. Sometimes a single person would collect fabric from their friends and then create the blocks individually and sign them for them. Other times, individuals would make them and send them to a friend, or they would all make them together sitting in one area. Friendship quilts took time collecting fabric or blocks from each person, piecing them together, and then quilting the layers. Individual blocks on a quilt may have been made over several years, and sometimes they were not put together into a quilt until much later. No matter how they were made, they all had the same purpose, and that was to record memories of cherished friends and family members. The one on the right is from, I believe, the 1880s, and this individual who it was made for was a single woman who liked to travel, and she never settled down and got married. And so all of her friends, because she traveled so much, each made her an individual block so that she would remember them on her travels. And so kind of just a fun quilt to think about. So how did our collaborative quilt project come about? In March of 2020, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic started. So we were working from home, and luckily, actually, as luck would have it, and this project would have it, it kept our museum in operation. So we came up with the idea early in the quarantine to make a collaborative quilt project, and what we thought we would get about 10 to 25 quilt blocks ended up being over 500. So in March 2020, when the world, along with Wisconsin and the United States, went into that quarantine as a way to help stop the spread of COVID-19, WMQFA put out a call for artists to submit 12 by 12 inch blocks that reflected their experience, thoughts, or feelings about the pandemic. What we thought would be that 2 to 4 week shutdown ended up being, well, you know, because of the pandemic, our allotted exhibition for the August to November spot was canceled for last year. And so we ended up rescheduling or scheduling in the quarantine quilts into that section. Due to that, it really sped up our timeline. So we announced the collection of blocks in March, and then the exhibit was set to go up in August. And so in about 1.5 months, we had 17 individuals helping us put together 27 quilts to go on exhibit. They quilted those 27 quilts in 1 month, and we managed to pull off an exhibit, which was honestly a phenomenal occurrence, and never something I want to do again. It was wonderful, but oh my goodness, it was a test of everything that I was taught and learned. The museum still has a few loose blocks, so we collected anything that came in by the end of June 2020 was incorporated into the exhibit, and we allowed people to continue sending us blocks until the end of December of 2020. And we still have about 8 to 10 blocks to put into a quilt. So, whew, it was a thing. So there we go. We ended up receiving, by the end of the year, 512 blocks. So far we have 28 quilts, and we should have 1 to 2 more. And each block during that process was given an individual number to help us keep any data that was sent along with them with the piece, because the whole point of the project was a collaborative history for the quarantine quilt. So people would send packaging, and they would send notes and letters, and sometimes they would send other additional things along with it. And it was really just kind of a fun, crazy process. So cover that. Okay, so to make those quilts, we had 3 individuals working to organize them into kits and to give them to our piecing volunteers. So the ones who were making the fronts, and then some of those individuals who did the piecing also quilted the whole thing, but some of them are not quilters. So you can be a quilter, or you can be a piecer, or you can do all of it all at once. So we got a group of those 17 women who did a bunch of those kind of things. So in the beginning, our first individual came in, and she wanted to make an art piece, and she's picked 49 blocks. She collected mostly the white background ones, and then she ended up making them into this huge face mask, which I will show you later in the presentation. And it was just phenomenal. And after she went through and picked the ones that she wanted, 2 other ladies went through and matched them by color or theme or group, and then denoted which individual is taking them home and made them into quilts. We also tried to keep semi-regular design patterns, but at a certain point that went away. So we tried to have all of the quilts have sashing, like this behind me. This is the in between each block is called sashing. And so we tried to have all of the quilts have that, but artistic expression based on the person who was making the quilt also occurred. So it's kind of a fun project. And the more blocks we received, the more we realized that besides the group themes, so we tried to do we thought about putting all of one type of block together and realized that they came in a variety of colors. So this one behind me is a lot of blues and greens. So we tried to do that instead of being like all of the blocks look like this. So all of the flowers in one panel or something. We realized that would have been an overflow of the senses to do it that way. So yeah, now we also made a very large Excel spreadsheet that details all of the data from every individual who donated something. So when somebody asks me, oh, which quilt is my block in, I'm able to research it and figure out what quilt they're in and then send them the information. So it's been a really fun process. Besides that, when all of the pieces came in, we would first freeze them, which is a picture here. This is like week 4 of the opening of the project. And so the first week I got 3 quilt blocks, and the second week I got 6 quilt blocks, and the third week I got 28 quilt blocks, and then I got 40 quilt blocks. And it was just like, it kept going up until all of a sudden it petered out. And it was a insane bell curve. When I thought I would get 5 of them, I ended up getting 500 of them, and it was amazing. So the first step we did after we opened them and collected all of the data was to freeze the pieces in case they had any outside pests. Freezing of objects doesn't work with COVID-19, so that wasn't protecting us against any of that. It was just making sure that they didn't bring any pests into the museum. So, I'm going to get the next part of this. We'll be getting into talking about what some of those themes are that were shared across blocks. So COVID-19 was definitely a big artistic muse for a lot of people. And so that involved using images of the virus that sparked individuals to be creative. So we received so many blocks that were shaped like the virus itself and used the black and lime green and red color schemes. Some like the second one in here, they formed the virus itself around the world to show it was the current impact and where it was majorly hitting in the global pandemic. Others like Pam created scenes about how the virus is affecting their lives. Pam was a caregiver for her mother, and so she used all of the wool in her, not actually a quilt block, but hooked rug design from her mother's basement, and that all of the wool in that actually belonged to her grandmother. So it's kind of a history of the wool in their family to be used in her piece. But she chose to make the setting of her piece in the lungs because that's the primary organ affected by the virus. She also had other symbolism in her piece that showed the impact of the virus around the world, including the broken heart for all of those affected, and different representations in there of death and mourning. So like the bird is a representation of death and mourning. But we also got a lot of bell curves and designs and flatten the curve images. So from those, lots of science and how it affected the world. So Catherine has her quilt block named Flattening, stated that after years in the academic, medicine, and science communities, I have been exposed to many data presentations using graphs and charts. I see quilts in many everyday and common patterns. The COVID-19 flatten the curve graph used internationally and originated by many academics and public health organizations gave me pause because I truly saw a quilt design. Yet I have heard about and witnessed both macro and micro level behaviors around the world, around the straight line hospital capacity reflecting in curved black lines. So my question to the individual observer is there ever a flat line? And will there ever be ability to flatten the curve based on our social and political structures and belief? So it's really interesting to see, now that we're not even, did we flatten the curve? And did she, was she musing at the very beginning of the pandemic, how it would affect our lives? Christine, right next to, or two down with the face, wrote, this piece is titled Contagion. It is a portrait piece of a girl who has contracted the contagious disease. Since we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, I chose to use red stitches to represent where the virus could enter the body, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Whereas Laura on the end originally sent hers in from Kirkland, Washington, which was the original first place that we thought the virus was spread out from. So we have learned since then that it was all over way earlier than we thought, but it was the inspiration for her as she lives in that area, and it was a big part of their life during the pandemic. So of course, we also have the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Fauci. He was immortalized in our quarantine quilt numerous times. He had such a large impact and an important role as the leader of the CDC that I wasn't surprised when he showed up in not only picture form, but also appliques of his name. Another very common thread, as you could call it, throughout the quarantine quilts were noting about looking for the helpers. So that phrase from Mr. Rogers, look for the helpers, was interpreted many times across the quarantine quilt. So the first one with a little, it's a log pattern-esque design, pineapple, whatever you want to call it. That one is made by Darcy, and I managed to hide her name somehow. But she used mask scraps to make that, and that was also a very common occurrence in the quilt blocks that we were sent. But next to it, Marjorie wrote, while sheltering in place, I watched Tom Hanks portray Mr. Rogers. His kindness, empathy, and patience made me reflect on my own life and how I can strive to be better. I've been so impressed at how so many people have stepped up to help others. Sewers, healthcare workers, police, firemen, essential workers. There are so many that I could not include them all in my block. But they're all heroes. And then the same thing with Laura. She was thinking about the same thing. So The words of Mr. Rogers always bring me comfort. When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And that was definitely a thread that went throughout the quarantine quilts. Another wonderful one was family. So throughout the run of the block collection, we received numerous family groups that were either sent in together, or they said so-and-so from wherever is going to be sending a block in. Can you try to put them next to each other? We tried, but you get 500 blocks. Sometimes you can't match them all back together. So the ones on the right was a grandmother and her daughter who made them together, and they used markers and puffy paint and just had a morning where they created quilt blocks. And the two on the left are siblings, and one is 2 and one is 3, and their parent just gave them blocks and said color them, and then they mailed them off to us, and that was wonderful. We got some other ones that were assisted about family. So our youngest participant was Kristen, age 1.5, and we have her hand and feet prints immortalized on one of our quilts. And then their sibling MJ and their cute little tractor and their foot tractor. The creativity in the quilt blocks that we received was phenomenal. And I don't know how many times I was brought to tears opening them and reading the letters from individuals, but it was a wonderful experience of hope. Whereas Sue on the right had this picture. So we had they couldn't see their grandchildren. And so she took a picture through the window and printed it and made it into a quilt block. Other blocks used their past to tell the stories of their families. So Astrid's quilt block here, she wrote, when I was sewing masks to prevent the spread of coronavirus, it struck me that the sewing notions in my sewing kit were all inherited from women who came before me, and that 6 of them lived through the 1918 flu pandemic. Grandmothers and great aunts, Nina, Joanna, Myrtle, Ethel, Bernadine, and Jessie. They lived in Finland, the Netherlands, and Wisconsin. So that has to be So this is passed through items to me that belong to women who made it through, who saw a lot in their long lives, and whose connection to me is vivid. This quilt block depicts the Atlantic Ocean with safety pins at the latitudes for the 3 countries that my grandmothers and great aunts lived. Threads from each goes into a bobbin and weaves together to hold a life ring buoy. I invited friends and family to choose fabrics from their masks from a collection I had from past projects. The fabric pieces that make up this block are scraps left over from the masks that I made. So not only is it of her past, but it also is of her current life and of her future lives. Both Jessie and Deanna, or Janelle and Deanna, used scraps from masks that they made for their family and friends to make their quilt blocks. And Janelle wrote, I wanted to join in a collaborative project for a while now, and this seemed to be a perfect opportunity. Like so many sewists right now, I started making masks, and this block is made with fabric that I used when making masks for my family and neighbors. All right, and then we have these 2 here are also blocks using scraps, but they represent their families in their current worlds, but in different ways. So the first block here, the log cabin, the one with the big yellow block in the center, was made by Diane, and she titled her block Adversity and Hope. And she specifically chose her fabrics to represent different things that were happening in the world. So she says she created this block for the quarantine quilt to salute the frontline healthcare workers around the world. I especially wish to honor my son, Robert, and his wife, Monica, who are both emergency medicine physicians in Washington State. They're also the proud new parents of their 3rd child, Claire, who was born in early May during the coronavirus pandemic. I deliberately chose the black, white, gray, yellow color palette for my quilt block. Gray signifies sadness, but also reliability. The flowers represent life going on despite adversity. The circles stand for continuity, dedication, and faithfulness. The black and white swirls suggest the chaos and randomness of the COVID-19 pandemic. The black and white abstract floral vines show exuberance for life despite the fear, death, and mourning of all around us. The central yellow square signifies hope, survival, optimism, and joy, and even in the times of trouble, pain, and uncertainty. Special thanks to Rob and Monica and all the fellow healthcare workers for their hard work, sacrifices, wisdom, selflessness, courage, and compassion. God bless you all. And then Cindy on the right, this one was made by her friend Linda, and Cindy's whole family are essential care workers. So she created this for her, and she put the lifesaver in the middle because Cindy very much likes candy. So There were also blocks that had remembrances. So the one on the left, this fabric belonged to the individual's mother who passed in June of 2019 before the pandemic. And the one on the right was a butterfly, which is a sign of new life, but the handkerchief was from the individual's great aunt who passed in 2005, and they inherited a very large handkerchief collection and wanted to show hope in their design. So what they think of when they made this piece was the Pinterest quote, perhaps the butterfly is proud that you can go through a great deal of darkness and still become something beautiful. We also had some very funny ones. So I like to call this a meme by any other name, or what do you meme? All of the puns for me. So humor and jokes were definitely a thing that was also incorporated into this, the blocks that were submitted. So Mary Beth, at first she thought of a turtle and how they carried their home on their back. Then I realized it could be a perfect play on words. So my title for this piece is Shelter in Place. I have been sewing since 1969 and quilting starting in 1974 with breaks in between for school and children. Lucy named hers Isolation, and it was because her dad was in a residential living situation since the start of COVID-19, and they can't enter the building, but they can see each other through the windows at times, feeling isolated. And then Bonnie, of course, this is a Sunbonnet Sue. So it's a new take on the Sunbonnet Sue with a whole bottle of bleach. So, rug hookers, in my experience, the one on the left here with the beat, are some of the funniest individuals. They're always plays on words, and they also call themselves hookers as a group term. So they're just very playful, very fun, wonderful individuals. So of course we have this one because stay upbeat with a picture of a beat. Betty next to it, which is behind me here, created one called Corona hair, which is something I think many of us can relate to, not being able to get your hair cut and going crazy, or also sometimes making the poor life choice to cut your own hair yourself if you're not great at it. Last time I cut mine, I cut 6 inches off instead of the 1 I was going for because I tried to put in layers. Did not work. And then on the right, there's, we got 2 quilt blocks that had toilet paper rolls in it, which was also a very beginning of the pandemic hoarding of toilet paper. So noting that was very representative of the pandemic itself. There are also quite a few with racial and social justice and indicating things that happen statewide and around the world. So the one on the left called Bird Watching, Kathy wrote, for most of my life, I have been an active birder. Still, bird watching took on a deeper meaning during the COVID-19 emergency. I watched a video that showed an individual being harassed in a park in New York, and realized that I had not had the same experience. This spring, like so many people, my husband and I watched the incredible migration of birds, finches, orioles, cardinals, starlings, grackles, and more at our feeders. Birdwatching has become a popular new way of gauging with the environment during a time of social distancing. I love birds and was shocked to read a 2019 science report that 3 billion birds have vanished each year since 1970 due to our human failings. So she created birdwatching for the quarantine quilt to represent the joyful birdwatching experiences like mine, but also how it was contrasted with other individuals who might be harassed in parks without realizing it. So she chose a goldfinch because she was fortunate enough to watch this beautiful bird visit their feeders and change to bright yellow during the early stages of quarantine. Perhaps it's his true color. What are our true colors in daily encounters, like what happened to Chris Cooper or George Floyd? We have clearly not acted enough to help our planet and each other. My piece asks, are you just passively watching, or are you taking direct action to help? And then Rosie Petrie, a local artist, created in 2020, George Floyd was murdered by the police. She's a local artist who does portraiture work. So it was really amazing to receive her piece, but it is another theme that was carried on multiple times throughout our quarantine quilt. So Teresa created a Black Lives Matter piece during the pandemic, and it talks about 400 years of slavery and oppression. And then we have the block on the right, which is titled Let Us Breathe, Black Lives Matter, which includes an assemblage of that blue mask that we all think of for quarantine, a Purell, and a miniature Whole Foods bag. we had more that incorporated other things too. Kalia's main background is the piece of the mask pattern that she was making. And then the piece on the right from Robert, this black represents the Chicago area and the events of the first half of 2020 through a modification of the Chicago flag, and it is inspired by an effort in Canada to promote staying at home, where the maple leaf and the Canadian flag was replaced by a home. So he created his own Chicago flag based on that Canadian flag change, but it also talks about the Black Lives Matter movement and LGBTQ individuals. And then we have individuals who had never created a quilt block before in their life. So that's really cool that our project enticed people to create something new that they'd never done during a pandemic. So Susan, the one on the left, her sister is an avid quilter, and she had never created a quilt block before, and her sister sent on this message to her about what she was doing. She's actually the one who made the Washington block earlier on. And so she decided that she also wanted to submit a quilt to our project and wrote a note that it was her first block ever and was very excited about it. Karen on the right also said, if this is painfully obvious, which I don't think it is, but I don't sew. I think she does. She loves quilts and has always wanted to learn to quilt. But where would I do that? Enter COVID-19 and everything changed. I bought my first sewing machine in April 2020, and I'm slowly learning a fun, relaxing hobby. As you can see from my piece, I have a long way to go. This was a fun break from many masks. Thank you for that. P.S. Before April, the only thread I owned was in one of those tiny travel button repair kits. I had never used it. Now I own metallic thread. So it's just incredible that she made this piece. I also am pretty sure that she's just a naturally gifted individual because it's a wonderful, wonderful block. We also got blocks that were made of unconventional materials. So things that weren't made out of straight cottons or other standard quilting pieces. So the one on the left, made by Frank, is titled Nothing Enters and Nothing Leaves. And it's a cotton foundation, but it is heavily painted and is incredibly stiff. So it's painted in blacks and grays and whites. Allie on the right used kind of the strangest material that she could find. So it's a lot of nettings and paint, and it's got polymer beads, but she named it A Window into Madness. We also had a felted piece. Katie created her block using felted and found materials. She wrote, "It represents nature to me. Nature fills my heart and soul. The seeds from last year are fulfilling their cycle, creating a beautiful spring." And then Bailey on the right didn't write anything. We just got the piece with the name. When we were looking at this fantastic weaving, we noticed that the yellow was a deconstructed rubber glove. So not only is it use of recycled materials, but it's also a statement about the pandemic and cleaning in one piece. And I never thought this would reach outside of Wisconsin, even our members. So we did end up getting pieces from around the world. So we received 7 blocks from 6 different international individuals. And it was such a joy to see them participate in our project and how far the project was able to reach around the world. So our first piece is on the next slide. I should have swapped those, but hey, whatever. So Linda named hers When Life Gives You Lemons, and it's using Photoshop and an applique technique. Anna titled hers Spread, and it depicts eyes and the corona shapes in silks and cottons. And then Erin from the UK, I didn't write what she wrote about, but that one's all cottons too. And then our very first piece was the one on the end from the Netherlands. And she named hers Corona Tears. And that one, when I opened it up, it was that first international block that we received, which honestly did bring me to tears. So a very cool piece. And then Anita on the left, she met a friend in an online group, and that individual introduced her to our project. And so she sent a piece to be put alongside of her new friend that she met online. And then Jude from Australia sent us both of these 2 pieces. And she wrote, "I hope isolation is not too stressful for you. I've been digging out UFOs, which are unfinished objects, a very big thing in the quilting and fiber arts world, and putting most things away and together. I hope I do not come too late for these, but never mind if I am. Keep safe and well. May your bobbin always be full, Jude. And then the photo of the white piece, it doesn't portray what she did, but it is a white paper piece. So all of it is white cotton and all of it is a paper piece, and it's this beautiful star. But it's such a wonderful thing to see that not only did we get local individuals, but it created a whole community around the world. So now, if you have any questions for me, I'm just going to show you what the completed quilts look like and then some of the walkthrough. So any questions, feel free to drop them. And then I'll just make my way through this part, probably talking a little bit more about these pieces. But, yeah. So these are our first two quilts. The quilts ranged from a 1 block to our biggest one is the 49 block quilt, which you will see. And they were, all of the individuals who made them donated the sashing and the backing fabrics. So not only did they donate their time and their efforts to creating and organizing these quilts, but those individuals donated their time and their money and their skills to create them. So I don't know if my cursor can come up, but my mom turned in a piece that was real exciting. One of my friends, she's also in this black and white one. So the hand in the bottom right corner, it's one of my friends, Hannah. And then the black one, kitty corner from it with the little L shape is my mother's. Very exciting.
Devyn, we do have a question in the chat from Laura, who asks, what finished size was the largest quilt and what size the smallest?
Oh, goodness. Well, the smallest one was about 15 by 15. And the largest quilt isn't square. So I have the numbers somewhere, but I don't know them off the top of my head, but yeah, we ended up cutting down some of the blocks because numbers and sizes, it turns out, is really hard for people to follow directions. So we got some blocks that were not 12 by 12s and not decorated in the interior in the 10 by 10 block space, which is fine. One of them, our largest one, was 15 by 17 or something. They're like, I just found this in my closet and we wanted you to have it for this cool project. And we were like, okay, we're gonna cut it down. But most of the other ones most of the time we tried to keep them in their integrity. So they really ranged in sizes. And then a couple of things, after you put them together in the quilt, you realize that they were supposed to be a different direction. So there are a couple of unfortunate errors that I wish I could fix, but I can't. And of course, the two that are right here both have 2 errors. So in the upper right, in the right of the blue one, that one's supposed to be rotated 1 degree. So that it's a flower. So it's just accidentally upside down. And then there's a rainbow one in the second row of the orange quilt, and that's a heart. And so that one should be like this. But if they didn't tell us what way was the top, sometimes we weren't able to figure out which direction the quilt block went. We had pieces that were painted. So the one in the bottom right corner of the right, with the person kind of saluting, that one was all painted on a quilt background. The kind of grayish one in that same quilt up to and over one was also painted. So it was fun to get the difference. So sometimes it was just they used markers, and sometimes they used applique, and sometimes they used like crazy quilting skills to make really nice points. And other times it was just in the same one on the right, straight down from the bottom, is just marker, and I made a rainbow on an old t-shirt. So it really, we gave parameters. So it had to be X size on a backing that was fabric, but from there, creativity was whatever the individuals wanted to make and whatever sparked them. So I think we got some Christmas blocks because they were thinking ahead to the future. You name it, we got Brewers stuff. I know you guys aren't in our area, so that might be a rivalry thing, but we got very Milwaukee and Wisconsin centric sports team stuff. And a lot of Chicago based things because of our proximity to that. But this is one of our smallest ones. So the funny thing is so the sheep on this fabric, it's a Moda fabric, and they beaded on top of that fabric all these sheep. So all of those colored sheep are individually strung beads that were embellished on top of those little sheep. And then the backing of one of our other quilts is that same exact fabric from the person who donated their time to make the quilt. So it was really funny that it's reflected twice in our project.
Devyn, we have another question in the chat, and this may make more sense to answer further along in your presentation if you come to some of the hooked rug pieces.
Yeah, so
we
that
do
should
have
be
a question. How did you work with the wool rug hooking blocks and build them into a quilt?
So I wouldn't say that one's a quilt. Like this one here on the right, that one is felted, and the individuals who are helping us put it together, there were just some blocks that we can't make into a quilt, so they became more hangings than they did quilts. So the rug hookers, the 8 of them who made it, we have an individual on our board, her name is Joyce, and she put a call out to her friends to help her make one hooked rug. So they all made their hooked squares, they sent it to her, she put it together, she brought it to me and said, we made this already. And we were like, oh, thank goodness. So theirs is just a very nice hooked rug that we had to put a sleeve on to hang. So not all of these are quilts. And I think that happens when you, like the weaving, it's hard to incorporate into a quilt. This felted piece, without destroying it, we can't incorporate it into a quilt. So the quarantine quilt at some point went from being these are all going to be quilts to this is going to be a fiber arts exhibit and display. Great question. You can't make hooked rugs into quilts. Can't quilt through those. They're too thick. So the one on the right here is, well, we talked about it already, so you all know all about it, but it's got found materials. The one on the left is a lot of our family blocks. So there was one family that we got 5 different ones, and they were about, like the mom made one, and then all 3 kids made one, and then a visiting grandparent made one. So it was just really fun to see blocks sent from family members. And then the whole one on the right here, that is, I just realized I don't know if my right is your right, so I'm sorry. The one that's got the orange and the lime green and the purple on it, that's a Girl Scout troop. So they sent all of theirs to us together, and so we decided to put them into one quilt as one unit. The same thing again with the orange and black one over here. That one was a high school, Cedarburg High School, so we put those all together to keep their stories. We've got the 2 from those 2 children on the one and the blue one on the one on my left, and those are the little feet. Mine is in this block. On the blue one on the left is the Origami Crane down on the bottom, towards the bottom. I think I'm the only staff member who turned one in, which feels a little cheap. Like everybody else on my staff should have also turned one in, but hey, you know, if it's my project, I had to for sure do it. Any chance these quilts would be exhibited at the future at the Carnegie Center here in New Albany? It's up to you guys. They are available for rental. We haven't sent them out anywhere yet. We have 2 local fairs this summer that we're putting them up, but after that point, then they're available to travel. We have a little bit more work to make it travelable, like, you know, printing all of the labels so that other people don't have to do all of that legwork and that kind of thing. But yeah, we're going to be using them for outreach and events, but for the most part, they're here and they're ready to be exhibited or taken wherever they want to go. So I talked about earlier, like most of our quilts have the very grid-like structure where they have the sashing, but sometimes you have a quilter who is a different type of quilter. So almost all of our quilts are made by individuals who use machines and do machine quilting, whereas this other one that is very, not chaotic, it's still sort of grid-like, but it's more relaxed. Everything on this one was hand done. So she hand pieced it all, she hand quilted it, and she did the backing and the batting that way too. It's also the softest quilt that we have from this collection, but it includes one of our international pieces and one that was almost put in upside down because when I first saw it, it's the very center block that has like diagonal. It has a Q and a Q, but I thought it was like a grape. So I had it the completely other direction, but luckily she knew that it was 2 Qs. So we learned a couple of things when we were doing this exhibit. One, that you can ask people to send you things, but they probably won't. And two, that you just really have to make educated guesses. So the white quilt is a different high school that sent in blocks. So it was part of their home ec projects. Because they couldn't come into the building and learn sewing, they were looking up quilting projects online, and our project came up. And so it became something that all of the individuals could, they're sent packages every week. So they were either sent a piece of this blue fabric and they could design it however they wanted, and then they had to bring it back to their teacher for grading. Or if they had scraps of things at home, they could make their own blocks. So you can tell the kids who already did sewing or were in some kind of home ec previous to that, or 4-H program where they made blocks, and then other individuals who just drew on them. And it was all like, what is the high school experience during the quarantine? There was a lot of like missing their friends and relying on phones and digital media to interact with each other. So it wasn't just, you know, you think of quilting, you think of old individuals sitting around and making quilts. That's not the kind of things that we got, and that's not what quilting is in general. I mean, it ranges age groups and diversity and you name it. Quilting is done by so many people around the world. This is the biggest one. So this is before it was made into the mask. The mask will be on the next screen. So this is in its 49 block 7x7 form. So technically it's the biggest one. And then it was made into this, which is phenomenal. So it's pleated. So if we did want to ever take it apart, which we won't ever take it apart because it's super cool, we could bring it out into its 7x7 form. But the individual who made this name was Linda, and she had a bunch of friends who also worked in the healthcare field. And so she asked them for their old scrubs that they were no longer using. And that's what all of the blue is. So all of the sashing and the edges of the mask and the ear flaps, that's all made out of old scrub material from her friends and family. And so there are pockets in there, and there are seams that are, and it's just, it was real hard to display, but she made like this rigid structure, and like we have all of the bends and everything for it, but it's just a really cool piece. Here's some more quilts. We've got the individual who said she'd never made a quilt before, or a quilt block before. And then the one with the 2 on the top, that's a Quilt Guild. So they all made 2 identical blocks. They kept one set for their Quilt Guild and then made their own collaborative quilt out of those. So I don't know what that one looks like, but I would love to see if it looks the same as what we made. So it's really cool to know that there is a similar but probably very different quilt out in the world that has the same exact blocks. This is the hooked rug piece. So it does have a sleeve along the top so that we can hang it, but they put them all together themselves. And look at, see, there are so many jokes. Rug hookers are just the funniest people, but they also have like, they have a lot of depth to them too. So, you know, safer at home, no haircuts, but then there's, you know, the very emotional pieces of, you know, the coronavirus in you and the time lost and lives lost. So, and then we've got the hanging woven piece. We couldn't figure out how to include that into a quilt either, so it just got a little sleeve on the back. And then this one was our very last quilt that was made for the exhibit. And this individual picked them up on a Friday and delivered the quilt on a Monday for us to hang. So amazing woman. Oh, couple more. And then, yeah. So this is what we have, we display in a barn gallery. So it's the original barn on the premises. We did raise the roofs in the basement so that, because we are not the height of cows, and also OSHA standards and all of the, you know, construction standards. So there's a barn within a barn upstairs for insulation and also electrical and all of that fun stuff. But it gives us this really unique background for displaying art. So it's a wonderful walkthrough experience. And these are some of the quilters who were able to, we had a small reception where they all wore their masks into the building and got to take their pictures by the quilts that they made. So these are all the individuals who helped us make the quilts. And we had over 400 people send us in blocks. Sometimes we would receive one and I'd be like, this name sounds familiar. And after 400 and some blocks, all names are familiar. So some people did send us multiple blocks, like they made one at the beginning and then we were still accepting them. So they made another one later with a different experience or whatever it is, or it was a creative starting point for them to get back into making things themselves. Because I don't know about all of you, but at multiple points during this pandemic, you hit a very low spot, and being able to make something for a project was really inspirational to a bunch of people. So. And this is the end of my presentation. So we have a newsletter that goes out weekly if you want to learn more about the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. I know we're very far away from many of you. We have a catalog that has all of the photos of them and some of the stories of our favorite pieces in the exhibit. And then we got a lot of stuff online. We also do online virtual programs. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can check those out on our website. And we also have a YouTube page. So all of our backlogged ones are there if anything I've said today sounds interesting to you. Otherwise, yes, let us know. We do rotate exhibits quarterly. So this one is, of course, down. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to put this beauty up behind me. And then, yeah, we're at the end of this month, we're taking it to our local. Well, we're taking it to another one in a different county. And then the different county heard that we were putting up our quilts there. And so our local area was like, why aren't you putting them up here? And we're like, because you didn't ask us. So now we're doing both. So in a couple of weeks, we'll be doing the state fair circuit with some of the quilts from the exhibit. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Devyn. We do have a nice comment in the chat from Laura who says, beautiful, wish I could visit in person. And thank you. So I know we had, and then we have another user that says, wonderful, thank you for sharing. Holly Ittle says, thank you. And I echo all of these sentiments. Thank you so much, Devyn, for sharing with us more about the Quarantine Quilt Project. I definitely enjoyed learning more about the process of putting the ask out there for these quilt blocks, showing people's experiences during the pandemic, and then to hear how many you received when you initially thought, oh, maybe we'll get 25, 30, and then you got 500. So so I was very interested to hear about how you all handled that. And then, of course, the process of figuring out which blocks would go together. And then you had your dedicated volunteers that were then piecing those blocks together and doing the quilting. So that was an amazing project. And as you said, of course, we are all always so grateful for wonderful volunteers who are able to do these kinds of things. Elmer Lucille, who is one of our program regulars and a regular Carnegie Center supporter and has also exhibited at the Carnegie Center, she says, thanks for all the information that you shared. So absolutely echo that. One thing, Devyn, that you mentioned during your presentation was that there were people who had used in their pieces different scraps from masks. There was one piece that was related to Black Lives Matter that actually had one of the blue masks in it. So I'm going to share my screen just quickly because we had a piece that,
oh, wow.
Yes, this was in our secondary school's art show, which is the middle school and high school students in New Albany, Floyd County. And that this show is actually on display before our current exhibit, which is our annual Form Not Function Quilt Art at the Carnegie National Juried Exhibition. But this young artist used the blue masks to create a dress And actually the piece got one of the Best in Show awards, and she also got an award from the Louisville Area Fiber and Textile Artists. And one thing, and this, I went and grabbed this off of our Instagram, so it's not the best clarity, but one thing we were so excited to discover is the handbag that is with the piece was actually made from the strings from the masks. Yes, isn't that amazing?
That's incredible.
We were so excited when we had visitors come in and they'd be examining the dress, and we would say, oh, but there's more. The handbag is actually woven from the strings taken off of the masks used for the dress. And you can, it's a little hard to see, but some of the masks are dyed a little bit darker blue. And it was just a really amazing piece.
That's incredible. I mean, that speaks to not only creativity, but resourcefulness and a commentary on what's going on in the world.
Absolutely. Yes. So we had, and I don't remember what grade this young woman was in, but again, is either middle school or high school. So showed incredible design and like you said, very timely piece as well.
Amazing.
Yes, thank you. So I did want to, so I tried to surreptitiously pop on Instagram, email it to myself, and then pull it up so we could share it here. So, well, thanks again, Devyn. Does anyone still with us have any questions for Devyn about either the Quarantine Quilt Project or the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts?
Always we rotate our exhibits quarterly. So right now we are actually having our 10th anniversary, well, our 10th anniversary exhibit and the 20th anniversary of that book. We had an intern and our curator researching all of the individuals who had originally had their stories collected for this book, and then reaching out to, because that book was written 20 plus years ago, reaching out to try to find the individuals who now own those quilts and asking them if we could put them on display. So we got 30 of the quilts, 5 of them are our own that we have in our collections here. And then about 6 other ones are from other institutions, other museums around the area that hold them in their collections now, but everything else was individually owned. One of the coolest pieces that's up there is a family quilt. It's called the Catherine Bradford quilt. It is passed down through the generations. The eldest daughter is named Catherine Bradford, first name Catherine, middle name Bradford, and it's this whole silk quilt. And it's so it's been through 9 generations of Catherine Bradfords, and it was made in the 1880s. So incredible piece. But yeah, real cool. It's the oldest quilts that I have ever handled in my life. So most of them are from like the 1840s to early 1900s. Really cool.
Well, thanks again, Devyn. It seems like we're about ready to wrap up. So thank you again so much. Absolutely. Thank you, Devyn. And thank you to our audience. We're so glad you could join us. And of course, if for our local folks joining us today, our current exhibit, Form Not Function Quilt Art at the Carnegie, is on display through this Saturday, July 17th. So you still have some time if you want to come and check out this annual National Juried exhibition. So thank you again. And Devyn, if you don't mind, after we say our goodbyes, to just stay on for a bit. So I can say thank you and a few housekeeping things. So thank you so much, everyone. We were so glad to see you. And stay tuned for information on our next Lunch and Learn program. We are still working on the topic and the speaker, so stay tuned. You can join our email list on our website, or you can always send us an email to info@carnegiecenter.org, or give us a phone call at 812-944-7336. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.